What is up, everybody? It is Alex from Heavy New York, and on Zoom we got Nico of Kardashev. Thank you so much for being here today, man. It's great to have you here.
No problem. Thanks for having me, Alex. I appreciate it.
Yeah, anytime, anytime. Thank you for an epic album to enter the summer with Liminal Rite. This is just an epic beast of an album, and a lot has happened. I would say there's a lot to celebrate for the Kardashev camp because the band originated in 2012, so this is 10 years of Kardashev. I mean, just looking back since it was 10 years since we first heard the progression demo, I mean, just how do you compare that to now with Liminal Rite?
How do I compare it? We've definitely developed a sound over 10 years. We figured out what we want to pursue and which things we didn't really find were matching with the brand that we wanted to be associated with. So we started incorporating softer elements, singing. The songs got longer and longer until eventually they were like 10 minutes long. But it feels really good. Um, Kind of trying to better understand, how we can develop the sound even further because sometimes as artists we feel like we plateau, and that might be the case for right now, post album release. So we'll see.
Yeah, well, you've been pretty busy, I would say, between the last full-length album and now because you released a couple of EPs as well. Did maybe the EPs that we heard in 2017 and 2020 maybe kind of signify the direction that we would later hear in Liminal Light in a way?
I do think so because those two records, the one from the Bearing of Shadows and Liminal Right, actually, those are the only two records we've had with this configuration, with this lineup. So there's a lot more of us sort of bringing in our influences into these records, whereas before the Bearing of Shadows, it was all just really me and Mark and our bass player Chris at the time. So it's a new dynamic, which I think we're honing our sound as we go, the four of us. But the Bearing of Shadows was the start of that, and I think this record kind of plays into the more mature version of the Bearing of Shadows.
hmm And with Liminal Light, was there kind of like a preconceived idea of what you wanted this album to sound like? Because I got many different vibes from all the different elements incorporated in Liminal Light. When you look at a song such as Silver Shadows, for example, and then you look at Cellar of Ghosts, and then you look at like Glass Phantoms, it almost seems like there's many different sounds, many different emotions incorporated in it. So was there maybe like a preconceived idea of what you wanted Liminal Right to sound like, or was there a lot of like improvising involved and a lot of experimentation?
I would say that what you hear is really the result of our natural writing process. Experimentation is part of that, though. The last track on there is like a doom track that kind of like gets sludgy and doomy at the end. So that one was the most experimental. But up until that point, we had to depend on each other for more than just writing in our wheelhouse for our instrument. Sean wrote an entire song. Alex wrote an entire song on more than their instrument. They wrote the guitars, the bass, the drums, whatever it was. They really composed the whole thing. And this was the first time that we got to do that because previously, like you said, the EPs were just kind of short. So I was able to compose them all within a year, and that was kind of it. With this, they wanted to try their hand at composition. They wanted to bring a song that they had in their minds to the album, and that's what helped it grow in its length, is that they had that freedom. So ultimately, those shorter records kind of helped influence, but we didn't really have an idea of what this record would sound like. It just sounds how we write, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I mean, I know I'm probably asking this way too far in advance right now, being that Liminal Right isn't even a month old, but do you think that this maybe laid down the groundwork of the direction that Kardashev will go in the future, in a way?
Yeah, actually, I think so. We kind of write outside of financial or commercial success. We look at it and we ask ourselves, does this make me feel good? Do I feel proud of this? And if that's the case, we pursue it. And as a matter of fact, we've already been showing demos to our community to show them that we are pursuing this sound, but with slight modifications.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like, you want to maybe have a sound that defines the band, but you also don't want to be pigeonholed. But at the same time, you want to experiment and try new things, but you also don't want to be all over the place. There almost seems like a lot of arbitrary lines involved.
Yeah, I agree. I think like progressive metal bands probably have the privilege of being able to bring in the real funky stuff more often because that's kind of their moniker. But when you're secured in like death metal or progressive death metal, there's still an expectation for the extreme elements. They want the double kicks, the blasts, the gutturals, whatever it is. And I think that's not as pigeonholing as it is refining because you can almost depend on it because people will be okay with it.
Yeah.
So I guess it's a give and take.
It's funny you like mentioned that famous P word, progressive metal, because I've interviewed a lot of bands that fall into that category, from Dream Theater to Between the Buried and Me to so many other bands that fall into that category that sound nothing like each other. At first I thought progressive music was just music that was where its shortest song was like 11 and a half minutes, but then you know, I so my conclusion is that progressive music is music that doesn't rely on a verse chorus sort of structure. But I'm curious, from the eyes of Kardashev, how would you define like progressive metal or even just progressive music in general?
Yeah, I love this question. I like the conversation of genre and the specificity of subgenres and stuff like that. So with progressive metal, I would argue that if they're not challenging a previously held, I'm not going to say belief, but like stigma about what metal's capable of, then I would say that they might not be leaning very hard into progressive. A good example of this, like you just explained with BT Bam and Dream Theater, I would say that also bands like Native Construct or Leprous, like those bands, they're bringing elements and musicality into the metal universe, and they're doing it well, right? They're not bringing it in and it just sounds like utter chaos. They're bringing it in and it's kind of refined, it's kind of elegant in its own right, and I think that's when we start entering the progressive tag onto those bands.
Yeah, because look, death metal. When I hear death metal, there's a sound that's associated with death metal, traditional in the traditional sense of the word. With black metal, there's a specific sound. With metalcore, there's a specific sound. But with prog, like the Contortionist, Opeth, Devin Townsend, and even Gojira has been labeled as prog as a couple of times.
Yes.
So it really almost seems like that prog metal is almost kind of like the broadest and the most diverse genre of subgenres.
Yeah, I would agree with you. It's kind of like the top of the tree, and then the silos start getting created and brought down. I think about it very, very similarly to genetics. There's like a Punnett square of like recessive and dominant genes that get carried in from the influences of those band members. Even somebody like Animals as Leaders with Tosin Abasi, like bringing thumping into the scene. Like this is, I mean, for the metal scene, that is right. Like you have your innovators, and then you have the people that are carrying this technique or writing style that's not often seen there, so they feel like the innovators of the progressive angle. Feels
Yeah.
nice.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And again, I think we should just say at this point, all is prog, right? Because every band, whether it is continuing a formula or it is sort of like pushing the boundaries in the end, there is always going to be some essence of innovation in there that goes beyond the norm.
Yeah, I guess so. You could probably objectively identify innovation in most records, so sure, I'll give you that. Yeah.
Fair enough. Fair enough. When it comes though to your sound, I mean, I think Kardashev could appeal to multiple audiences from not just the prog metal aspect, but with the melodies that are incorporated in it. I could see metalcore fans. Like I could easily see a fan of Parkway Drive appreciate Kardashev as well. Is it fair to say that, kind of a cliche question, but is it fair to say that everybody in Kardashev kind of has like their own influences that they take inspiration from?
Yes, it is absolutely fair to say that none of us are a one genre listener. Everybody sort of pulls from different stuff, and as a matter of fact, I talked about this with the band recently. Everybody except our bass player, we don't really listen to metal very often. Like we listen to it when we see like a new release, and we hear like we're like, oh, I want to give this a try, or I want to see what they're doing differently. But our rotations now are not really metal, and that might be showing in our music. Um, you know, I listen to like symphonic music, piano, hip hop. There's a lot of stuff that I hear that is influencing me because ultimately my heart wants to write metal, right? That's how I express myself. But that doesn't mean that I'm like pulling from currently existing metal tropes because it's just not really in my playlist that often. So yeah, everybody kind of has their own unique influences that they bring to the band for sure.
I think the metal scene, and it wasn't always like this, but I think the world of heavy metal has gotten a lot more open minded in what they appreciate. Like, you're not gonna. I know plenty of metal musicians that will listen to, whether it would be techno or synthwave or EDM or classical music, or there's a great appreciation for country in a lot of the metal scene as well. So I think in the end, metal has just been able to come up with all these genres because we've always been open minded and have always been able to kind of create a hybrid with other genres as well.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, the emotional effect of music can be provided through many lenses. whether it's through, the storytelling of country or like the simplicity of piano work. There's something in there that's still effective. And as long as you're not dependent on blast beats, guitar solos, and gutturals, you'll probably find similar effects once you hit the right music. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
fair enough. But again, like, for instance, metal has combined country music with it, no doubt about it. But how many times have you seen a country band combined, another genre with its sound? Like, are you gonna see a symphonic country band? Are you gonna see, like a bluegrass EDM band? Like, I feel like metal has
Wow.
kind of been able to bring in everything, whereas other genres that have been kind of labeled like, we know what a country band is gonna sound like, we know what this sort of band is gonna sound like, etc.
Actually, yeah, I do agree with you on that. My experience is pretty limited outside of like looking at the progressive country music. Like, I obviously don't know any progressive country artists, but metal is really good at adopting everything but itself into itself. It's kind of like the amoeba of the musical genres. It's always looking for inspiration and maybe even the inclusion. I mean, look at, bands like the Faceless, BT Bam, whoever, but they started bringing in like brass and woodwind instruments with like saxophones and stuff. They're bringing in an instrument, and then but here's the thing, they're allowing it to retain its character of maybe like a jazzy nature. So now you're having this association with jazz, even though it's really just the nature of a saxophone to carry the jazz effect. So I think that's a really good example you bring up, is that metal is kind of it's like the basis by which you can incorporate all other genres or many other genres.
Definitely, definitely. And circling back to Kardashev, like, does music all when it comes to writing a song, does it always start off in the same way? Is there a formula that you always work off of? Does it always start with guitar? Does it always start with rhythmic elements, or has every song kind of called for its own approach?
This is a good question because up until Liminal Rite, it was always a very similar approach. I would sit here at my desk and I would just kind of work on melody and composition and riffs. And once I had those kind of solidified, I hand them off to the guys and they fill in their parts and send it back to me. And that sort of inspires me to keep writing. So it's kind of this like cyclical pattern. On Liminal Rite, um, we we followed that process, but our bass player Alex composed an entire song on his own after we had gotten to a certain point in the writing process. Our drummer Sean, he went into his own archive of musical creations, and he found a song that he thought was kind of fitting. And so he offered that to us, and that's Cellar of Ghosts. And so he composed his own music. So really what was nice about this is we reached beyond our own like wheelhouse instrument, and we offered new stuff. A good example of this would be like when Sean started recording the narration parts for the record. That was a completely different take on what we were used to, but it helped us kind of define where the album was going. So in that way, it was pretty unique.
And you mentioned the narration, and that led me perfectly into the next question because, and I know you're not the vocalist per se, but like when it comes to like the lyricism incorporated in Kardashev, I've always just the band name alone, Kardashev for people who may not know is a very famous figure from Soviet times in a way. And whenever a band has like a historical reference in their title, it always makes me maybe be unfair on my part, but I always just assume that they're very conceptually driven in a way. And I do consider Kardashev to be a thinking man's metal band, like a band like Mastodon or something like that. So, what with Liminal Right, was there sort of like a conceptual element that kind of tied everything together? Bottom line is, to make a long question short, would you consider Liminal Right to be conceptual or a concept album?
Yes, absolutely. And I tend to agree with you. When I see a band name that's like the Voynich Code or uh, I don't know, some other band, but I can't think right now. But yeah, like when I see that, I'm like, oh, this is a concept band. They like simple ideas that they can then use an album to tell a story around or grow in complexity. And so with Liminal Right, it is that as well. Musically, it never starts that way. I always write the guitar parts and the compositions from my heart based on what I want to hear. It's not like a methodical process that I have like charts and keys, and I don't depend on any of that. But lyrically, Mark takes the music that we write, that we deliver him, and he identifies the key emotions that he feels just while listening, and he tries to bring those to light for the lyrics and the storytelling. So in this regard, there's kind of a melancholic sort of feel across the record overall, like kind of like like heartache, no pun intended, like heartache in your chest, like, oh, I feel like I'm missing something or I missed someone. And so he took that sonic vibe and he wrote the story of the lost man over the whole record. And so this is a concept album. Our previous works are concept albums. I was asked this question before, and I kind of returned to the question with a question, and that is, Alex, do you think that there is anything but a concept record when you listen? It's either a playlist of singles that are an album, or it's a concept record. Is there anything else? I might be short-sighted on this.
I think it depends. For me personally, I sometimes go and I listen to an album sometimes with a specific goal. Like one of my favorite albums, off the top of my head, maybe it's because you guys have the same publicist, but Ulcerate, Stare into Death and Be Still. That is an album where every time I put it on, I have to listen to it from start to finish. It is the sound of sheer misery, and it pulls me into this void of darkness that I just can't escape from. That being said, to this day I don't understand a single word on that album. The vocals, are very distorted, which I think adds to it. And I really don't, not to say that I don't care, maybe I'll dive into it. I don't that album becomes a concept album in my own right as I listen to it with a specific purpose. But you take like an album, a classic album, whether it would be Fear Factory's Demanufacture, Mastodon's Crack the Sky, or even My Chemical Romance's The Black Parade. That album is written with the intent of a story. With Fear Factory, you gotta demanufacture. You have to open up with demanufacture, end with the therapy for pain, and so on and so forth. So, I think that there are albums that are concept albums, and if you want to know the concept, you listen to it in a specific way. I think that there are some albums. There are plenty of albums where I just want to let out aggression, so I'll just put on Cannibal Corpse or Morbid Angel and let out my aggression with that, just for the sole purpose of getting emotion. I think every album serves multiple purposes and multiple stories and multiple inspirations. That's thanks for coming to my TED Talk.
Hey, that's okay. That's a great perspective. I always kind of approach it from the creator's perspective of what am I making, a concept record or something else. But I love how you just brought into light this perception of whether it's a concept record or not, you can depend on certain moments of the record. Whereas some records, like with Ulcerate, you intend to listen to it from start to end. I have records like that as well. Melting Sun by Lancelos, I have to hear it from front to back. I don't want to pick a specific song. I want the whole vibe across. So that's an interesting perspective, and I appreciate you sharing that.
Definitely. And I think, there's a difference between an album being a concept album and an album being conceptual in a way. I think that there is a difference. There are albums that could be conceptual because maybe there is an underlying theme around it, like Amon Amarth, maybe their albums are written with the intent of being concept albums, but every album is also about Vikings and Norse mythology and stuff. So it could be conceptual. One minute they could be writing about Thor, and then the next minute they could be writing about, Beowulf, to a degree. I think, and then one minute they could be writing about Ragnar LeBlanc, if I pronounce his name right. So just because an album or a band has a theme doesn't necessarily mean it has to be conceptual as well. It's like almost a term. You could be spiritual without being religious, but you can't be religious without being spiritual.
Interesting. Oh, I like this. I'm gonna have to explore this concept more because this is new to me.
Oh, really? Hey, if I played a role into writing a new Kardashev, that will be my greatest accomplishment as a journalist.
You're gonna be in the credits on the back page. It's gonna say, "Thank you, Alex, for your contributions in helping us write not a concept album, but a conceptual record."
If that happens, I'm gonna retire from the interviewing thing because I've officially reached my goal. Thank you.
No, thank you. Yeah, that's cool.
And the final question I wanted to actually ask you is because going back to your sound, and I did, have to read about you guys on Metal Archives, of course, because that place is wonderful. But like, I know that every member has been involved with a couple of bands as well, and I mean, Kardashev could almost be theoretically a super group. And you for an example, you were involved in Composer, you were involved in Never Breath. So like, what is there maybe a different mindset when you're focusing on Kardashev as opposed to other projects, or does working with other projects also help you bring in some new stuff to Kardashev? I remember you mentioned that Sean had like a musical idea that archived somewhere that he brought to you as well, so thought maybe that was the same case for you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So each of us is definitely pretty well versed with other bands and other directions. Again, going back to our previous discussion with concepts and conceptuality, most of the bands that I've been in have had a concept that they're sort of dependent on for their brand or their sound or whatever it may be. Never Breath is kind of a funny example you bring up because that was just a project that I did in a week. And Mark happens to be close to me through the Kardashev relationship. So I was like, hey, do you want to scream on this record? And he was like, yes. And then I asked Sean, I said, hey, you're already working with us on Liminal Rite. Do you want to do Never Breath? And he was like, yes. So we're able to just kind of like make a little fun side project and bring it to the table when in reality, Never Breath is a series of like riffs and ideas that I know are too black metal for the Kardashev sound. Like there's some parameters that we try to write within in order to retain, I guess, the trajectory of our development. So Never Breath is just a bunch of like the black metal ideas that Kardashev was kind of steering away from, brought to life in their own way. Similarly with Mark, he's also in a band called Varamia, where he did vocals on their latest single a couple years ago. And for him, he's really drawing inspiration not from his other musical projects, but rather where he is in life currently. Like he really pulls in the present and tries to like develop upon that. So if you were to go back and listen to our earliest record Progression from 2012, you'd hear a different set of like inspiration and parameters for Mark's involvement than you would for Liminal Rite. And so it's kind of interesting to just look back lyrically and conceptually at how the inspirations have changed. The same thing is true for Sean though, and Alex. Alex is in another band called Holy Fawn, and they write kind of like noisy, what's the word? I don't even know. They write heavy, beautiful sounds. That's how they describe themselves. And so he's always on tour. They're perpetually on tour. And so he gets to talk and rub shoulders with a bunch of people that he's on tour with. And that helps him kind of come to the table with a new perspective when we're going to write a record. And then, like you said with Sean, he does have previous projects that he was a part of, a solo project called The Great Filter. Again, another like sci-fi sort of like concept idea. And then that's where he pulled that music from for Cellar of Ghosts. And then before that, he was in a band called First Rain in Canada, where they were kind of like the weekend warrior metal band that you could watch at the bar at the venue. And so I think each of those experiences does affect the way that we write. But ultimately, because we're not all sort of pulling double duty, triple duty with multiple bands at the same time, we're really not depending on those experiences or influences when it comes to Cartage.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So before we go, I want to thank you so much for your time today and for a great in-depth discussion. You know, it's what I love about doing interviews. It's like you never know how deep you're going to go and the lessons you could learn. Is there just anything else with the release of Liminal Light that you would like to promote? Maybe a Kardashev U.S. tour or something like that?
Oh yeah, it's been great talking to you too, Alex. I would love to go deeper into the genre discussion and the prospects of conceptuality versus concept records.
Absolutely. I just don't have enough space
As
on
far
my
as
computer to record a conversation as long as what we would have. That's why I had to stop it.
Oh, that's understandable. I'll keep it brief then. We're not promoting any tours right now because of the nature of our band. We can't really pull tours off, but I will recommend anybody listening and checking this out to go to kardashevband.com and check out the Enlisted Traveler program if you want to check out our demos and be a part of our process.
Sounds good. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Nico of Kardashev. Check out Liminal Light if you haven't already. We'll see you next time on Heavy New York.